Court will impose the mandatory life sentence for the murder of Colleen Ritzer and set a parole eligibility date of 25 years, the highest level our law allows. This court will impose a concurrent sentence of 40 years to 40 years and 1 day for the rape of Colleen Ritzer and a concurrent sentence of 40 years to 40 years and 1 day for the armed robbery. In imposing a sentence for the rape at a date in excess of the parole eligibility date for the murder, the court is not suggesting that the rape, as heinous as it was more egregious than the murder. Rather, this court is constitutionally obligated to set a parole date no more than 25 years for her murder. While Colleen Ritzer's rape and murder were inextricably intertwined, this court may not punish the defendant with more prison time for the rape than justice demands for the purposes of avoiding constitutional limitations imposed by our Massachusetts Declaration of Rights as interpreted by a Supreme Judicial Court for the murder committed by a juvenile. Sentence may be imposed.
On October 22nd, 2013, a ninth grader at Danvers High School in Danvers, Massachusetts, named Phillip Chism, did the unthinkable. At just 14, he brutally murdered his 24-year-old math teacher, Colleen Ritzer. The reportedly joyful Ritzer was known to go out of her way to help her students with math, had asked Chism to stay after school that fateful day in October. She did not know that the plot Chism had to put in motion days before. At the end of the school day, Phillip Chism followed Ritzer into a school toilet. Holding a box cutter, Chism robbed, raped, and killed her. He then rolled her body in a garbage can to the wooded area behind the school. Chism then took himself into a town, bought a movie ticket using Ritzer's credit card. When police caught him the following morning, Phillip Chism had not washed his hands and still had Ritzer's blood all over them. Phillip Chism, a 14-year-old student at Danvers High School, was reported missing by his mother, Diana Chism, during the early evenings of October 22nd, 2013. A picture of Mr. Chism was decimated by the Danvers Police Department via Twitter and Facebook posts. Danvers residents also received a reverse 911 call. At roughly the same time Phillip Chism was reported missing, Colleen Ritzer, a Danvers High School math teacher, failed to arrive home after school, and her parents were concerned because it was not like Miss Ritzer to deviate from her routines without alerting her parents. On October 22nd, 2013, Topsfield police officer Neil Hovey was at home with his family in Danvers, prepping for his midnight to 8 a.m. shift. Officer Hovey learned before heading to work that was a report of a missing 14-year-old student from Danvers High School. Officer Hovey was concerned about the missing teen. He informed dispatch his intentions to check the area of Topsfield, that borders Danvers, to look for the missing student. Before Officer Hovey left for work, however, he received a call from dispatchers that led him to believe that the missing student had taken his own life. On October 23rd, Officer Hovey was joined on his shift by one fellow officer, Joseph DeBernardo, and dispatcher Joseph Newton. The dispatcher from the previous shift, Larry Nestor, called the Topsfield police station to report having seen a black male walking on Old Route 1 in Topsfield on the highway, close to the tree line. Upon receiving this information, Officer Hovey and DeBernardo responded to the area of the report. The Topsfield police has consistent policies of checking on people they observe walking on Old Route 1 to make sure that person is safe and to offer transportation to a safer location. The Topsfield police station is located on Old Route 1, north of Danvers. Officer Hovey is in uniform and operating a marked police cruiser, drove south of the police station towards the area of Salem Road on Old Route 1, approximately 2 miles from Topsfield police station. This area of Old Route 1 is on a hill with an incline of the southbound side. The area is devoid of light from any businesses. The few houses that are in the area set well off the road. No street lights illuminate the area. The area of Old Route 1 is unsafe for walking. The individual is on a little bridge that further narrowed the already narrow and darkened highway. There is no shoulder on the bridge. Officer Hovey did a 3-point turn in his police cruiser, parked in the middle of the road. The time was approximately 12:28 a.m. Officer Hovey activated his blue emergency lights for his own safety and the safety of the driving public. The speed limit in the area is 45 miles per hour. Southbound drivers would only see the police cruiser after coming up the incline. Officer Hovey notified the station of his location and then exited the cruiser to cross the street. The individual, identified at the hearing on the motion to suppress as the defendant, Phillip Chism, stopped in unison with Officer Hovey's cruiser. Officer Hovey observed the defendant to be wearing shorts, a zip-up sweatshirt, black knee socks, and sneakers. The defendant's manner of dress seemed to Officer Hovey to be inappropriate, considering the temperature was in the mid-40s. Officer Hovey asked the defendant where he was going. The defendant responded, nowhere. Officer Hovey then asked the defendant, where was he coming from? The defendant responded, Tennessee. Officer Hovey once again asked the defendant, where was he going? The defendant again responded, nowhere. During the exchange, the defendant continued to look straight ahead as if Officer Hovey was not there. As Officer Hovey approached the defendant, he did not believe the defendant was the missing juvenile. Indeed, until the defendant said he was, Phillip Chism. 3 to 5 minutes later, Officer Hovey thought the defendant was in his late teens or early 20s. The defendant was taller than Officer Hovey. The defendant's hands were in his sweatshirt pockets, and he was also carrying a backpack over his shoulder. Officer Hovey asked the defendant where he lived. The defendant responded that he had no address and had been walking for days. The defendant did not look disavowed. Officer Hovey then asked the defendant if he had identification on him. The defendant responded no. The lighting was such that the Officer Hovey could not determine whether the defendant had any bulges or hard objects on him. Officer Hovey then performed a pat frisk of the left front pocket of defendant's shorts. Unbeknownst to Officer Hovey, Officer DeBernardo had just arrived on the scene at the time of the pat frisk. When Officer DeBernardo first arrived, Officer Hovey had already spoken to the defendant. Before exiting his cruiser, Officer DeBernardo radioed the station, maintained traffic flow, and only then approached the defendant after Officer Hovey. Officer Hovey felt a hard piece of plastic in the defendant's left pocket that felt to the officer to be an identification or a credit card. Officer Hovey then checked the defendant's right pocket and felt a 2-inch smooth, hard object. To avoid escalating the situation, Officer Hovey stepped back to await Officer DeBernardo. Before Officer Hovey realized that Bernardo was present, Officer Bernardo, upon arrival, had activated his blue lights overhead, taking down light and spotlight to illuminate the area. Officer Bernardo observed the defendant repeatedly putting his hands in his sweatshirt. Officer Bernardo then asked the defendant to take his hands out of his pocket and asked him what the defendant had in his backpack. The defendant responded, survival gear. Officer Bernardo then took the backpack. While traffic was sporadic, passing cars were traveling approximately 40 miles per hour. Officer Bernardo asked the defendant to come off the road. He escorted the defendant to the other side of the road between the two cruisers. The defendant was still not making eye contact with the officers. He appeared to Officer Bernardo to be in kind of a long-distance stare. Officer Hovey asked the defendant to remove the contents of his pockets and place them on the trunk. The defendant complied and removed a rock and a driver's license, insurance card, and credit cards, all in the name of one, Colleen Ritzer. When the officer observed these items, they were without information concerning Miss Ritzer or a missing teacher from Danvers High School. Officer Hovey then asked the defendant his name. The defendant responded, Phillip Chism. Both officers recognized his name and were immediately elated at having found the missing teen. Officer Hovey then went into what he described and then court credits as a parent mode. He called the Danvers Police Department on his cell phone to confirm the name of the missing teenager. The time was just before 12:35 a.m. Officer Hovey then asked the defendant where he got the credit card. The defendant responded that he found them at a Stop and Shop. The officers, knowing that there was no Stop and Shop in the Topsfield, asked which Stop and Shop. The defendant replied that he did not know. The defendant replied that he did not know, and then the officer asked him where did he obtain the other identification. The defendant responded, from her car. The Danvers police requested that Topsfield officers bring the defendant to Danvers police station. The Topsfield officers were unable to comply since only 2 officers were on duty. Officer Bernardo asked the defendant if he would get into the back of the police cruiser to get warm and accompany them to the police station. The defendant responded, okay. The defendant was placed uncuffed into the back of the officer's cruiser and transporting the defendant to the police station. The officers also considered information that possessed concerning a possible larceny. The officers, however, would have brought the defendant back to the Topsfield police station, absent evidence of the larceny. The defendant arrived at the Topsfield police station at 12:41 a.m. The defendant was escorted up to a steep stairway into the station, brought to the booking area. The booking room is about 12 by 20 feet, well lit, with a couple of desks and a wooden bench. The defendant would not have been able to see the jail cells from where he was sitting. He was not handcuffed, and the officers provided him with a blanket because he was shivering. On October 23rd, 2013, Topsfield Police Department had a written policy handling juveniles. That referred to the Topsfield Police Department protocol entitled Detainee Processing. While both policies were admitted into evidence and speaking for themselves, the Handling Juveniles policy provided the status offenders, including runaways, are to be held in non-security custody and may be held as long as enough to complete identification, investigation, and process, then released to a parent or guardian. The detainee process policy governs inventory searches of detainees. It provides that all of their outer clothing and packets, bags, and other containers bought in all personal property be searched as part of the inventory. This requires applied to closed containers. Specifically, the detainee processing policy states that any container or article found on the detainee's person or carried by the detainee shall be opened and its contents inventoried. Accordingly, it is the routine practice of the Topsfield Police Department that when they separate property from an individual, they conduct a general inventory and have the individual sign the inventory sheet to reflect its accuracy. The Handling Juvenile policy calls for the process of juveniles who are at the station, even if they are not detainees. The defendant's backpack was placed on the counter. Officer Hovey asked if there was anything dangerous in the backpack the officer should know about. The defendant responded, yes. Officer Hovey was concerned. He put gloves on and started removing the contents of the backpack. The first item removed was a purse containing numerous items, including female underwear. Also inside that purse was a box cutter with a protruding blade. Officer Hovey observed a red-brown substance covering most of the box cutter. Officer Hovey asked, whose blood is this? The defendant responded, it's the girl's. At the time Officer Hovey asked this question, they had no information concerning Ms. Ritzer or an injured girl. Officer Hovey then left the room and called the Danvers Police Department and, on 2 separate occasions, spoke to Captain Patrick Ambrose. Captain Ambrose told Officer Hovey the Massachusetts State Police were coming to pick up the defendant and not to talk to the defendant. From that point on, Officer Hovey did not ask the defendant any further questions. The call between Officer Hovey and Captain Ambrose occurred at approximately 12:50 a.m. When Officer Hovey had left the room to make the call to Danvers Police Department, Officer DeBernardo remained in the room, asked the defendant if he knew where the girl was. The defendant responded, she's buried in the woods. Officer Bernardo then asked if he could still help her. The defendant responded, no. The time was approximately 12:56 a.m. Officer Bernardo then read the defendant his Miranda rights from a card. The defendant indicated that he understood his rights and that he wanted to speak to the officer. The defendant signed the form. The Topsfield officers made no attempt to find an interested adult to talk to the defendant concerning his Miranda rights. Officer Bernardo was in the presence of the defendant the entire time. The defendant was at the Topsfield Police Department. Officer Bernardo noticed that the defendant had brown reddish stains on the sleeves of his sweatshirt and a ski mask that was around his neck. The Officer Bernardo seized some of the defendant's clothing and his sneakers. After questioning of the defendant seized, the defendant asked Officer Hovey if he was going to get his shoes back. Officer Hovey responded, no. The defendant then asked for something to eat and drink. The officer, however, responded, not at this time. Members of the Massachusetts State Police, including Sergeant Connor, arrived to pick up the defendant approximately an hour after the defendant arrived at the Topsfield Police Department. During the hour, the defendant remained on the wooden bench, uncuffed, with at least one officer observing him at all times. Officer Hovey informed Sergeant O'Connor the details of the Topsfield Police Department interactions with the defendant. Sergeant O'Connor then asked Officer Bernardo to handcuff the defendant behind his back. Police investigation at the Danvers High School prior to the discovery of Ms. Ritzer's body. Steve Balzer is a Danvers police officer assigned to Danvers High School as the student resource officer. On the evening of October 22, 2013, Officer Balzer was informed by a supervisor that a Danville High School student had been reported missing. Sometime roughly around 10:30 p.m., Officer Balzer arrived at the Danville High School to review video surveillance in the hopes of assistance in search of the missing teen. Upon arrival, Balzer spoke by telephone to Caroline Quigley, a parent of a student. She informed that she had seen a student she believed to be Phillip Chism changing his clothes outside the academic wing of the school by the student parking lot near the A and B wing of the school at approximately 3 p.m. Danvers High School principal Susan Aberzik, who was also the school, informed Officer Balzer that Colleen Ritzer was also missing. Officer Balzer instructed Danvers police officer Stephanie Winberg to check the interior of the building near the student parking lot where Ms. Quigley had identified she had seen the defendant. Officer Balzer then went to the office to review the video surveillance on his computer, but the computer would not boot up. The video surveillance system had only recently been installed as part of the renovation of Danvers High School. The system included hundreds of cameras switching through the video. While the system was rebooting, Officer Baldwin went to the wooden area near a cross-country trail off the student parking lot to meet with the captain. Officer Winberg informed them that the police officers had found Miss Ritzer's bag, a recycling bin, some shoes, clothing, and some brushes near the cross-country path, other items belonging to Miss Ritzer. This wooded area is near the student parking lot, the A wing of the school. The officer observed what appeared to be blood in the recycling bin. The time was shortly after 11 p.m. Officer Winberg had also observed blood in the second-floor women's bathroom near Miss Ritzer's classroom. While still in the parking lot, Officer Balzer received a cell phone call from a former student, Joseph Mello. The time was approximately 11:15 p.m. Mr. Rapello reported he had seen Phillip earlier in that day in a corner at Danvers High School. He also saw 3 or 4 other kids on bicycles outside the academic wing. Mr. Mello did not know whether these other kids were connected with the missing student. Danvers Police Sergeant Phillip Tansey arrived on scene at approximately 11:45. He directed Officer Balzer to return to his office to view the video surveillance. As Officer Balzer reviewed the video, he had access to Twitter and Facebook posts that Danvers Police had already previously posted about Mr. Chism. Officer Baldwin made the following observation of the surveillance video. Mr. Ritzer and another teacher talking in the hallway at approximately 2:30 p.m.
This morning from one of Colleen Ritzer's fellow math teachers at Danvers High School. Sarah Giaquinta and Colleen Ritzer were more than colleagues. They were friends. So close that on October 22nd, 2013, the day of the murder, Sarah dressed as Colleen for Dress Like Your Friend Day during School Spirit Week. Ritzer is seen here on the left talking with Giaquinta in the hallway after school. Moments before Phillip Chism followed Ritzer into the bathroom, where his defense team admits he raped and murdered her. Giaquinta told the jury that Chism was one of the topics the 2 teachers talked about briefly in the hallway.
What did Colleen say to you just about why the boy was in her classroom?
She said, I don't know why he's here.
Late this morning, the doctor who performed the autopsy on Colleen Ritzer showed the jury the purple top.
Miss Ritzer leaving her classroom, walking down the hallway. Moments after, Mr. Ritzer left the classroom. A male party fitting the description of Phillip Chism leaving the same classroom, putting a hood over his head. Miss Ritzer entered the female bathroom. Individual Officer Balzer believed to Phillip Chism entered the female bathroom with a hood over his head. Moments later, an individual dressed somewhat differently than Mr. Chism comes out of the female bathroom wearing a mask. The absence of the video depicts Miss Ritzer leaving the bathroom, a male party entering, leaving the bathroom with a recycling bin, exiting the school with the bin, walking in the direction of the cross-country path. In disgust, Balzer called Detective Robert Sullivan at the Danvers police station at approximately 2:30 a.m. to inform him of the content of the video surveillance. Detective Sullivan, who was viewing an interrogation of the defendant, relayed the information to Trooper. Sergeant Tansey ordered a cannon search radio for the Danvers Fire Department to bring in their thermal image unit to try to pick up heat signatures to find a living person and notified the on-call. Massachusetts State Police detective assigned to the SS County District Attorney Office. Sergeant Tansey also requested assistance of Massachusetts State Police Air Wing, which had the capability of providing illumination and thermal image for surpassing the Danvers Fire Department technology. Additionally, officers were called in earlier for the morning shift. Emergency medical technician were called to Danvers High School. Meanwhile, the Danvers Police Department was also trying to ping the cell phone of both Miss Ritzer and the defendant. Trooper Butchery was the on-call CPAC detective on the evening of October 22nd, 2013. At approximately 12:15 a.m., he received a call through Massachusetts State Police Headquarters to contact the Danvers Police Department concerning a missing teacher and student from Danvers High School and the discovery of evidence of violence at the school. Trooper Barucci spoke from his home to Danvers Police Detective Robert Sullivan, who provided him with additional information. Trooper Barucci arrived at the Danville High School at about 12:30 a.m. on October 23rd. Upon arrival, he entered the wooded area of the cross-country trail, observed blood inside a large recycling bin, clothes suspended on some brush with blood stains, a pair of sneakers. With the aid of a flashlight, Trooper Barucci searched the woods and observed a pair of white gloves with stains on them in the wooded area near the path, which referred to as the rail trail. Shortly after making this observation, Trooper Barucci was in the parking lot of Danvers High School on his cell phone, briefing Detective Lieutenant, the commanding officer of the SS County District Attorney. When it was notified, the Topsfield Police Department had located defendant on Old Route 1. Upon being briefed, Lieutenant Zook went to Danvers to observe the scene and to coordinate the investigation. He spoke to Sergeant Tandy from the Danvers Police Department, and Trooper Barucci went to the Danvers Police Station. Trooper Barucci also went to the Danvers Police Station. After comforting the lieutenant, Captain Ambrose called the Topsfield Police Department, told officers Hovey not to question the defendant. Sergeant Tandy called Diana Chism, the defendant's mother, and informed her that Phillip has been found and asked her to go to the Danvers Police Station. At approximately 2 a.m., Lieutenant Michael Holleran, Kelly King, Emily Despres, and other members of the crime scene service sections of the Massachusetts State Police arrived at the Danvers High School. Lieutenant Holleran and other members of the crime scene service, including Kelly King and Emily Despres, made observations at the scene before, during, and after the defendant's statements at the Danvers Police Station. Lieutenant Holleran observed what appeared to be blood in the recycling bin and bathroom in question. He and his team illuminated the area, began to document and photograph the scene. Shortly after 1:30 a.m., Ms. Chism arrived at the Danvers Police Station at approximately 1:45 a.m. Sergeant Tandy began to interview Ms. Chism. The interview was recorded. Lieutenant Zook and Trooper Barucci also participated in the interview to some extent. Although they were also in and out of the interview room during the interview, they were simultaneously dealing with another alleged homicide in the county. At the time the interview with Ms. Chism commenced, the defendant had not yet arrived at the Danvers Police Station. The officers were polite and forthright with Ms. Chism. While the interview, transcript, and recording speaks for themselves, one of the Sergeant Tandy's understandable goals was to find Miss Ritzer. When the officer informed Ms. Chism that she would have an opportunity to speak with her son, none of the officers explicitly told Ms. Chism that her role in consulting with her son was to assist him in understanding and deciding whether to waive his Miranda rights. At some point during the interview, Ms. Chism, Lieutenant Zook, was informed by Sergeant O'Connor that a bloody box cutter had been found in the defendant's backpack along with women's underwear and a credit card and a license with Ms. Ritzer's name on them. Lieutenant Zook also learned that the Topsfield Police Department had asked where the items came from. Lieutenant Zook was told that the defendant responded the girl. Lieutenant Zook was also told that the response to a question from Topsfield Police Department was to whether she could be helped. The defendant said no. Lieutenant Zook's goal in speaking to Ms. Chism was to get as much information as possible from her before the defendant arrived at the station. Based upon his experience, including 23 years of experience with Massachusetts State Police and 23 years assigned to investigating homicides, he believed that Ms. Ritzer had been murdered. Nonetheless, based upon the volume of blood in the bathroom in question, he did not have information that there had been an attack that no one could have survived. Interview of the defendant. Shortly after 2 a.m., the defendant and his mother were brought upstairs to an interview room on the second floor of the Danvers Police Station. The defendant and Ms. Chism were given approximately 8 to 10 minutes to consult privately before the interview began. Trooper Barucci and Sergeant Tandy were assigned to interview the defendant. They agreed before the interview began that the defendant, being a juvenile, was not going to be bullied or misled and that he would be treated in an age-appropriate manner. The interview commenced at about 2:30 a.m. Unbeknownst to the defendant, the interview was being observed by Lieutenant Zook, Detective Sullivan. During the interview, both Lieutenant Zook and Detective Sullivan were providing information as they learned it to Trooper Barucci in real time. Officers brought items. Trooper Barucci included copies of surveillance video, Google Maps, and that were utilized during the interview. When the interview began, Ms. Chism presented the defendant was handcuffed. Trooper Barucci and Sergeant Tandy did not know the defendant was handcuffed until he was asked to draw a diagram of where Ms. Ritzer's body was located. The entire interview was audio and video recorded. The interview lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. Before the interview began, Trooper Barucci knew that the defendant had been in possession of a bloody box cutter and Ms. Ritzer's credit card. In addition to the information he observed firsthand or been briefed on at Danvers High School, as referenced above, the interviewer also were informed that the defendant stated that he had cut the girl and that the defendant thought the cut was fatal. As discussed below, the police provided Miranda warning to the defendant and asked the defendant numerous questions unrelated to the location of Ms. Ritzer's body prior to her body being discovered. At the time of the interview, the police had no evidence that a firearm had been used or that a defendant or any other suspect possessed a firearm. During the interview of the defendant and until Miss Ritzer's body was found, the air wing of the Massachusetts State Police and the Danvers Fire Department used infrared technology to attempt to locate Miss Ritzer. Without success, K9 still was being used by law enforcement at Danvers High School while the defendant was being interviewed at the Danvers Police Department. Also, without success, medical personnel were also on the scene. Before and during the interview, officer posted a various entrance and exit of the rail trail in Danvers, but no area beyond the school was searched. Sergeant Tansey did not know the name of the teacher who was missing or what course she taught while interviewing Miss Chism or the defendant. At no point did the police say anything untrue or attempt to trick the defendant into statements inconsistent with the evidence they had this far gathered. The court had reviewed the video of the defendant's statements on numerous occasions. It is not the court's intention to summarize the entire interview, which is the evidence that speaks for itself. The court, however, makes the following observations of the interview. The interview began with Trooper Barucci offering the defendant a glass of water, introducing himself, and introducing Sergeant Tansey. Trooper Barucci, Sergeant Tansey, tone during the interview was polite, patient, respectful, and calm. During the time Ms. Chism was in the interview room, the defendant was not looking or interacting with her. When Ms. Chism suggested different soft drinks the defendant might drink, he replied, no, to her 4 times without looking at her. Before the police provided the defendant with his Miranda warnings, Ms. Chism said to the defendant, Phillip, honey, what can I do? The defendant did not respond. Trooper Barucci carefully went through the Miranda rights with the defendant and Ms. Chism and informed them that the interview was being recorded. Once the Miranda rights were explained, Trooper Barucci asked the defendant whether he wanted to waive those rights and voluntarily wished to make a statement. The defendant said, what? And Ms. Chism said, no. It is unclear from the video recording whether Ms. Chism says no to the waiver or whether she does not hear Trooper Barucci completely. The defendant then said that he did not hear the question and then stated, not really. Sergeant Tansey then made a statement to Ms. Chism, seeking her assistance in having the defendant speak by referencing the previous conversation 10 minutes earlier. Sergeant Tansey then said, these are just words and these are just your rights. Ms. Chism emphatically stated that she wanted to have an attorney present. Trooper Barucci interjected, this is a serious situation going on here. Ms. Chism then referenced to her son, despondence, and that she doesn't know what is happening. The Trooper Barucci responded, that's what we are trying to find out. Ms. Chism then again asked if she can get an attorney tonight. She then referenced why she thought it was important to have an attorney from her career perspective. She then turned to her son and said, if you want to talk, you can talk. The defendant then responded, I don't know. Ms. Chism then stated, it would be better for you to talk. The defendant said, no. Trooper Barucci continued to talk to him, referencing bringing the defendant's corroboration to the attention of the district attorney's office and trying to help the injured person. In a declarative sentence, Sergeant Tansey then stated, explain to us what happened so we can understand what happened. The defendant then asked whether he had to talk with his mother in the room, referring to her as she. Ms. Chism then offered to leave, and the defendant emphatically responded, then leave. I don't know why you're here. The defendant was still not looking at his mother, Ms. Chism, then told the defendant, I'm here because I love you. To which the defendant responded, I do not care. Ms. Chism stated to the defendant, you do care. To which the defendant responded, just go. Ms. Chism signed the Miranda right form, and she was about to leave. She said to the defendant, anything you want to say to me? The defendant responded with emphatic, go. Near the end of the interview, the defendant stated, I have a very dislike sick for my mother and anybody else. When Ms. Chism exited the room, the defendant immediately stated in response to a question from Sergeant Tansey, very bad things happened. When the police asked the defendant to help them understand what happened, he referenced a comment and trigger word he said Ms. Ritzer used. Through the interview, however, despite many attempts by the officer, the defendant refused to divulge what the trigger word was. The defendant claimed Ms. Ritzer said it to him. A number of important statements the defendant made during the interview were inconsistent with the physical evidence and indicated that the defendant had the ability and intention to lie. For example, the autopsy revealed that Ms. Ritzer was stabbed 16 times in the neck. The defendant stated that he cut Ms. Ritzer twice. The defendant described the attack and the amount of blood that would have been found in the bathroom were inconsistent with the limited amount of blood found in the bathroom. Shortly after Ms. Chism left the inner room, the defendant started to make eye contact with the officers for the first time. When the defendant discussed knocking out Ms. Ritzer, he stated He looked at the officer when he discussed taking Miss Ritzer out of the bathroom in a recycling bin. His tone grew louder. When the defendant was asked the color of the bin, he answered carefully that it was a blackish green. The defendant corrected the officer when the misstated something. When the officer asked Miss Ritzer's body was in the Topsfield, the defendant dismissively responded, "No, she's not in Topsfield." When the officer commented about Miss Ritzer eventually coming out of the bathroom, he corrected him. The defendant provided the sequence of events, explaining where Miss Ritzer's body was, related to what recycling bin, and explaining he took her body out of the bin, chunked the bin pretty far. Towards the end of the interview, the defendant, in a calm, measured voice, explained how he put Miss Ritzer's clothing and everything he had on him in the recycling bin with Miss Ritzer's body. When the defendant was asked to draw a map of where Miss Ritzer's body was, he responded, "Yeah, I don't have a problem with that." During the course of the interview, the defendant drew 3 different diagrams. The defendant, in conjunction with Sergeant Tangi, drew a map of Danvers High School in an attempt to locate Miss Ritzer. The defendant wrote the word body on the diagram. The defendant also, in conjunction with Sergeant Tangi's, drew a diagram of the area in which the defendant indicated he had smashed in Miss Ritzer's cell phones. The defendant drew a third diagram which documented where Miss Ritzer's stab wounds were located on her neck. Trooper Barucci drew a head, and the defendant marked the drawing the injuries he inflicted to her. The defendant indicated about 24 minutes into the interview that he was very hungry. Much later, after Miss Ritzer's body was located, Lieutenant Zook left Danvers Police Station to get defendant food. He returned shortly after and provided the food. The defendant was concentrated, alert, oriented through the interview. He was also able to remember his locker combination, the sequence of events, and how he disposed of some of his clothes and other items. The defendant answered, while not always forthright or appropriate to the question. For example, when the officer asked the context of how he got the recycling bin downstairs, whether students were allowed to take the elevator, the defendant's tone changed. Controversial. As he provided an explanation. When the defendant was drawing a diagram at one point, he asked whether he needed to label everything. The defendant explained how he had chose to label certain things to help clarify the diagram. The defendant carefully responded to the officer's question, suggested that the defendant premeditated the attack, and the question concerned the defendant planning to stay out in the woods. Later in that interview, the defendant discussed a different plan that suggests that he wanted to get caught and go what he called juvie. When the officer suggested for the first time that there might have been a sexual assault by asking how Miss Ritzer's clothes came off, the defendant provided an explanation inconsistent with the forensic evidence. There is evidence of a sexual assault, and sperm cells were recovered from Miss Ritzer's, consistent with the Y profile of Phillip Chism. The defendant clarified questions during the interview concerning the clothes he was wearing and confused concerning the video surveillance. Later in the interview, he reviewed photographs from the video surveillance, explained that he was both entered and left the bathroom. When the defendant discussed his desire to escape to Canada and the route he would take, Trooper Barucci asked whether the defendant would take the Applecline Mountain Trail. The defendant responded that he would take a bridge and a ferry to escape. When the defendant discussed the attack, the amount of blood that resulted from cutting the arteries in Miss Ritzer's throat, he volunteered that he knew where he was hitting and what would happen. The defendant then voluntarily said that he knew all 269 meridians. In further discussion about meridians, a pressure point, that the defendant provided a graphic and detailed description of the following. The way it works is it's kind of like a dragon kiss. The blood all rushes up, and so when it hits, it's a lot more than a lot of blood. Numerous statements that the defendant made during the interview were corroborated by the police. For example, the police corroborated the defendant's statement that he had eaten at a fast food restaurant after leaving the school. Throughout the interview, the defendant is introspective, polite, calm, and cooperative. After Miss Ritzer's body was found and the officers reviewed the defendant's Miranda rights again, he indicated that he was willing to speak to them, except for a comment that Miss Ritzer used to say to him. Later in the interview, the officer asked the defendant if he was okay with his mother letting them talk to him without her being there. He responded, "Oh yeah, I don't want to talk to her." As for being introspective, the defendant explained why he claimed he blacked out, why he attacked Miss Ritzer. He believed that the importance of being self-sufficient, his dislike of people who try to help him, and that he doesn't really have a sense of morals. When asked if he would mind taking a look at a surveillance video to identify himself, the defendant responded, "I wouldn't mind it. I mean, I'd give you straightforward answers. I'm saying it would have really have emotional effect on me, or the effect that I was wrong, because I don't really believe in morals." When expounded on his motive for the attack, the defendant stated that after she insulted me, That's when I became the teacher. Later, when asked about why the defendant took Miss Ritzer's pants off, he responded that he did so to humiliate her. The defendant was cooperative and precise in his explanations and descriptions of events. For example, the defendant explained where, why, and how he broke his phone with precision. He volunteered his concern about the GPS coordinated on his telephone being used to locate him. The defendant carefully explained what the video surveillance depicted. He even interrupted Trooper Barucci in order to identify himself on the surveillance video to ensure that they understood what they were seeing. Sergeant O'Connor remained on the scene at the Danvers High School and in contact with officers at Danville Police Department. While the defendant was being interviewed based upon information obtained from the interview of the defendant, Lieutenant Zook, through Sergeant O'Connor, directed Lieutenant Holloran down the path. As Lieutenant Holloran went down the path, he noticed an area of disturbance on the forest floor. He retrieved a more powerful light source for his car, returned to the area, then observed a tow. They uncovered Miss Ritzer's body. Miss Ritzer was dead. He observed a very deep wound in Miss Ritzer's throat area. He sent Miss King to get the EMT to declare Miss Ritzer dead. The time was approximately 3 a.m. Trooper Barucci and Sergeant Tanji were 40 minutes and 20 seconds into the interview of the defendant. When the defendant left Danvers High School, he walked towards a street in Danvers. Sometime in the mid-afternoon, he threw a cell phone he had taken from Miss Ritzer, to the ground, smashing them near Hollywood Hits. The reason the defendant destroyed the cell phones was to prevent detection through GPS tracking. The defendant contends that he was seized for constitutional purposes when Officer Hovey had activated his blue lights. The defendant further contended when Officer Hovey pat-frisked him and when Officer DeBernardo took control of his backpack, it constituted a seizure without constitutional justification. The Commonwealth concedes that the defendant was seized when Officer Hovey pat-frisked him and that the pat-frisk was permissible as part of the police officer's community caretake function. Whether the moment of seizure was the activation of the blue lights or the pat-frisk does not impact the doctrinal framework of the court's option. This court rules that the moment of seizure was when Officer Hovey pat-frisked the defendant and that the backpack was seized when Officer Bernardo took control of it on Old Route 1. While the pat-frisk was a seizure and the backpack on Old Route 1 was without constitutional justification, the items seized during the pat-frisk in the backpack are suppressed for multiplicity and independent reasons. Even after being caught for this heinous crime, the defendant filed a bunch of motions to get a lot of the items and things that were part of his case seized. The defendant's motion to suppress the contents of his pockets and back pockets were denied. The defendant's motion to suppress evidence seized at Danville High School is denied. And the defendant's motion to suppress his statement at the Topsfield police station was denied. The defendant's motion to suppress his statements at the Danville police station was allowed. The defendant's motion to suppress the cell phone found near Hollywood Hits was allowed. The videotaped interview reveals that the defendant's initial hesitation to speak with the officers was caused by his refusal to speak about the alleged rape and murders of Miss Ritzer. While his mother was present, the defendant's willingness to speak to the Topsfield police was questioned about the content of his backpack, the state of box cutter, and whether the hurt person could be helped. Revealed that the defendant was not unwilling to speak to law enforcement. He was only unwilling to speak to the police if his mother was present. Furthermore, after extensive review of the videotape interview, the court found that the defendant was calm in voice, calculating infliction when divulging information. The defendant, Will, was clearly not overborne by the officer's questioning, evidenced by the defendant's repeated refusal to reveal the trigger word, despite multiple attempts to the police officer to elicit a response. Furthermore, on several occasions, the defendant corrected the officer's statements and clarified facts, which the court finds is highly indicative of his voluntariness to speak with the police. The court also finds it significant that the defendant provided an account of the event that minimizes conduct and does not comport with the forensic evidence. This is highly indicative of the fact that the defendant was not overborne throughout the course of the interview. He spoke to the officers voluntarily. According to the defendant's statements, while voluntarily made, must be suppressed because the court cannot find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily waived his Miranda rights. The defendant stated that the Danville police station will not be available at the Commonwealth as evidence during its case in chief. Since the court finds the statement was made voluntarily beyond a reasonable doubt, however, if the defendant testified at trial, the statements will be available to the Commonwealth for impeachment purposes. Phillip was then convicted by the court of law to a life sentence in prison for the murder of his math teacher, Colleen Ritzer, in October of 2013. And then later on, he was tried as an adult for a separate youth detention center situation where he raped and assaulted another woman. He was sentenced to 40 years for that crime. Thank you guys for watching. I really do hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that I was able to help you understand the Phillip Chism case a little bit more. If not, you should go around and look at more videos about this person. He was only 14 when he committed the crime, and it happened to turn out he got a life sentence still, even as a minor. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Pete Duggan is out.
A man convicted of killing a teacher in Danvers when he was a teenager has now pleaded guilty in a separate assault case. 25-year-old Phillip Chism pleaded guilty today in Suffolk Juvenile Court to attempted murder and kidnapping charges. He was 15 when he was charged with attacking and seriously injuring a female DYS worker back in 2014. The incident actually happened while he was in custody, awaiting trial for raping and killing his Danvers high school math teacher when he was 14. A judge sentenced Chism to 17 to 20 years in state prison for the attack on the youth worker. He'll serve that at the same time he's serving his murder sentence, which runs at least 30 years.